Okay, good morning. My name's Darrin Grimsey. I'm a partner at EY based in our Melbourne office in Australia. And I've got a career spanning some 20 plus years in PPP advisory. I started my career in the early days of the UK's PFI in the early 90s, and I migrated to Australia just about the time when PPPs were really taking off in the early 2000s, and I was fortunate enough to be one of the architects of the Partnerships Victoria PPP policy guidelines and worked on many of the projects that have taken place in Australia. If we could, today what I'm going to give you an understanding of is the schools PPP landscape in Australia. It's very similar actually to Alan's example from Alberta. The model is remarkably similar. There are a few nuances to that model though, and there are a few differences. For example, you may have seen me shaking my head around that question around bonuses. We do not give bonuses for early delivery of schools projects in Australia. We have very much the same philosophy as Alan articulated there. We need the schools by the December, because our school year starts in the January-February. Slightly different because it's Southern Hemisphere. And we don't give an honorarium either for bid cost recovery for schools projects. However, we do for larger infrastructure projects like transport projects. So there is bid cost reimbursement in Australia, just not for the PPP in schools program. And I think in large part that's been because the schools in PPP program in Australia is very much seen as the easiest type of PPPs to do. They're relatively small in capital size terms, around $200 to $300 million capex for these projects. And that compares to, say, our health sector, where typically a hospital PPP in Australia is anywhere between $1 billion and $2 billion. So just one health hospital PPP project in Australia is something like 5 times the size of a PPP schools project. And in transport, our projects are between 5 billion and 15 billion. So that gives you some context as to where PPPs sit in the kind of the spectrum of models that have been undertaken in Australia. So the challenge really has been to create enough scale to make PPPs worthwhile in schools projects, because it's not cheap to do them right. Just because hospital projects are 5 times the size of these school projects, it doesn't make these school projects any less complex or sophisticated in how they're put together. So you need scale in order to make these work, and then hence the bundling. And we have bundling the same way as Alan described for Alberta. I don't think we've been as sophisticated as in Alberta in creating those geographic bundles that have created the right kind of scale for efficiencies. And that's very much a learning that you saw coming through from Alan from ASAP 4. And all of the projects that I'll be talking about are around the schools program, but I also wanted to introduce some other projects that we've done in the education sector. Sorry, you're moving forward too fast. I'll do this when to turn. So we have university accommodation, and Lynn briefly mentioned that in her presentation, and they are quite different projects to the PPPs in schools. We also have a tertiary education facility in Southbank TAFE in Brisbane in Queensland, which is just a bigger version of a schools project. And we also have Kangan Batman Automotive Centre of Excellence, which I will talk about, because that's a very different PPP to the other projects. But moving to the schools projects, these are the major schools PPPs that have been done in Australia. Not very many of them when you consider I'm covering the whole of Australia here, a population of 22 million. There haven't been that many schools projects over the last 14 years. And in large part, our capital expenditure program in schools has been done in the traditional way. So Lynn mentioned the figure of about 10%. About 10% of overall capital expenditure in, say, Victoria, which is the state I come from, the little bit at the bottom there, of the south of the country, would apply to all of the PPPs across all sectors. But in schools, it's much, much less than that. So in schools, I'm guessing, but it's more like under 5%, probably 1 or 2% of the capital expenditure program is put into PPP projects. There are two projects not on that diagram. They are currently in procurement. These are the projects that have been completed and are currently operational. The two in procurement, there's one in Victoria at the moment, which is a bundled program, which is currently at expression of interest phase, and there's one in Western Australia, which is currently at shortlist and moving to request for proposal stage. The features of these projects are remarkably similar. They're small capital values, I've said, and you can see that on the screen. They are very much a vanilla PPP structure. They're all design, construct, maintain, and finance structures, and I'll go through that in a bit more detail in a moment. There are some nuances, though, and I'll pick those out. They have very similar value for money drivers for doing the projects. But again, and I'll pick this up through the course of my presentation, there are a few nuances which it's worth bringing out. And of course, they're all bundled projects and they're all green fields. So they're all in growth areas, very similar to Alberta, tend to be on the periphery of our major metropolitan areas, although the most recent schools project in Victoria has moved into the country area. And we're very much experiencing the same sort of issues. You create scale by doing that bundling, but you lose efficiency because you disperse those projects over a large geographic area. And it's very, very hard in the Australian market to make these deliver value for money because of the cost of the risk pricing cost of finance. And it's important to understand that within Australia we have a big market for secondary education as well. These are only projects which are done for the public system. So the public system where government employed teachers will be put in place in these schools and will provide education free at the source of delivery. Not free to the taxpayer, of course, but free at the source of delivery. We also have two other sectors in Australia. We have the private sector, which actually amounts to around about 40% in Victoria, probably a bit less in other states, of the overall education delivery. That is not free at the point of delivery. That is, the parent has to pay for the teaching. And within that, we have a denominational system. We have a very large Catholic system, which, again, you have to pay for your education, but it's at about half the fee levels of the private system. So the public system is big, but in Australia the private system is also very big. So there is a fair degree of competition around private healthcare delivery, which, in many countries that would be viewed as a public-private partnership of itself. It's not viewed that way in Australia. So if we move to the next slide, essentially this is the feature of this is how the PPPs in schools are put together. Special purpose company, a project service agreement with government, banks and institutions providing debt. Unlike in Canada, we do not have an open capital markets at the moment, so bonds are not available, so it's mainly banks, shareholders providing equity, and then spilling out underneath that we have the turnkey arrangement for the construction contract, an operations and maintenance agreement, and there might be other service subcontracts as well in place. And this translates into this wiring diagram. And this is a very, very typical structure, and it's remarkably similar to Alan's diagram because our projects are very, very similar in the way that they're structured. I just wanted to pick out a couple of slight nuances here. You'll see to the right the debt funding and the equity funding coming into the special purpose vehicle that's created to deliver the project. What we've seen in Australia, particularly since 2008, is that risk pricing has blown out for debt funding in particular, not for equity funding, but for debt funding in particular, as a result of the global financial crisis. Nothing to do with the risk profile of these projects. So you have systematic risk on a global scale, which is impacting upon the risk pricing for these projects. And as I said, these projects are plain vanilla at the small end of PPPs and are already difficult to deliver with value for money. So what we found is that this has marginalised PPPs in schools. So what the response from government has been to remove debt funding from these projects. So we've had a distinct move in Australia towards government contributions for these types of projects. So a large proportion of the debt funding, not all of the debt funding, but is taken out with a capital contribution. And we've had quite a bit of debate in Australia about how that contribution is put into these projects to try and still maintain the risk profile of the on-time delivery and the KPIs for the performance of the asset over time. And we've had many different models, and in fact, South East Queensland Schools was the first one to have a structure put in place in around about 2009. And what they did there was that at the end of the construction period, the government paid out about 50–60% of the debt and put in place its own debt facility called a supported debt model from its Queensland Treasury Corporation, and charged the project more like government rates. And in fact, the SPV has to pay back the Queensland Treasury Corporation. No other state has done that. All other states have moved away from that model, and now what we see after trial and error in a number of situations is that government puts the capital contribution in as a lump sum on commissioning of the facility. So what we see now is up to 40% of the debt is retired on commissioning, successful commissioning of the project, and the remaining debt and equity is left in the project as the risk capital, if you like, that sustains the risk profile as you move through operations. So that's been a feature in Australia of recent projects. And where this plays out, of course, is on this diagram. I'm very pictorial, so I like diagrams. This is a very simple representation of the risk transfer that is achieved through the PPP projects in Australia, also in Canada. And it illustrates how, by translating that capital cost into an amortised, privately financed payment stream from government, you effectively transfer the on-time and on-budget delivery of the capital component. So the capital costs and time overruns, as Alan has already said, no payment will flow unless it is delivered on time. And so, same thing in Australia, the amount of time to repay that financing reduces, and that reduces the returns that the risk capital can achieve. So no completion, no payment. The second attribution here is to point out is the functional performance of the facility over time. And similar to how Alan described it, we have KPIs over time, which is that within that operating cost component, which results in abatement if the facility does not achieve the performance that it's required to achieve. And the third component is capital replacement. And avoiding what's become known in Australia as facilities maintenance backlogs, avoiding that by placing the burden of capital replacement over 25 years on the private sector, which is maintained within the repayment profile of the project. So that's the way the private finance achieves the risk transfer. The challenge for us in putting in capital contributions and by government coming in with supported debt is to maintain sufficient capital at risk within the structure so that we don't undermine that risk transfer. And that's been quite a challenge, particularly in these projects which are at the small end and are relatively marginal. So if I just turn to the value drivers, the next slide. I've talked back please. I've talked about the risk transfer component and the fixed profile. There are a number, that's the sort of quantitative manifestation of the value for money equation, but there are a number of qualitative features as to why Australia has adopted PPPs in schools and indeed in other sectors. A very major driver is the high level of maintenance service provision that is achieved through this model. It's very apparent in the vast bulk of the facilities that education facilities, also health facilities, where successive governments have tended to underinvest over time in facilities maintenance, underinvest in refit and refurbishment, and as a consequence, the buildings they deteriorate. And of course, what happens? The departments come back cap in hand to Treasury and say, well, we need major capital investment. So what PPPs are doing in the education sector is removing that issue and cutting through the budget cycle and putting in place a fixed payment profile which matches the whole of life performance of the facility. That's a very important value driver. The second aspect is that the school management can focus on